Welcome to the week in 60 minutes. I'm Fraser Nelson. Coming up, the Starmer supremacy. I'll be talking to John McTernan about the implications of a Labour supermajority. Then to Stockholm, where I'll be talking about Sweden's new child gangs with Fredrik Kärrholm, a former police officer, now a member of Parliament. Then Richard Dawkins, is there such a thing as a cultural Christian? And then finally, Beyoncé's new album, the one everybody's talking about. I'll be talking about the politics of her taking on country music with Rod Liddle and Ricky Ross. Now, before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, then please do subscribe. You can do that on the red button on your screen. Click that and you'll never miss an episode. And if you haven't tried the magazine before, then please do so. We're giving away 4 weeks free at spectator.co.uk/subscribe. Now to business. Keir Starmer is predicted to win and win big, with as many as 450 MPs at the next Parliament. But what would that mean for the House of Commons? 2/3 of all MPs would belong to the Labour Party, big enough not just for the government, but for opposition as well. Katie Bowles writes in this week's Spectator cover piece that this will transform the way political debates are held in ways we haven't really started to discuss. So let's discuss them now. I'm delighted to be joined by John McTernan, who is a former political secretary to Tony Blair. Now, John, you were political secretary for Tony Blair back in the day. He was seen to have a pretty big majority in 97, but if you look at some of these MRP polls, we're looking at a majority of 250, sometimes people say 450 MPs. Now, to put that into context, the House of Commons doesn't actually have room for 450 MPs.
And look, if Labour had 450 MPs, it could split into a party of 300 and a party of 150 and be the government and the opposition at the same time. And I still think in my bones, I feel the possibility of 500 is discounted too easily. I think this feels like a 1993 Canada general election moment, a moment when the country moves so quickly, so solidly, that the government just evaporates, that the Conservative Party in Canada down to 2 seats. I think in the UK, the possibility of under 100 seats is real because the mood in the public is they've switched away, and the longer this goes on, the worse I think it gets.
It's worth talking a bit about Canada. I mean, there you had the Conservatives went from 198 seats to 2 seats. Right? Now, why did that happen? Because the right was split, because a new party came along called Reform. Yeah. And then Reform were saying that these Conservatives aren't really conservative, and because they had the first past the post system, as we do, that allows big majorities. It also allows for pretty big collapses. And it's interesting I've been hearing Conservatives talk a lot about that. But basically what happened there was the Canadian Conservatives were basically, they dissolved, they were gobbled, they merged Reform eventually, they came back, like 12 years later. But you're saying then that we could be, right now it sounds crazy to talk about 450 Labour, 100 Tory. It could be even bigger than that.
A lot of coverage, until the really good piece that Katie's written, a lot of coverage in the UK politics is all about what's happening on the right, what's happening in the Tories, because they're the government, what's happening between the Tories and Reform, because that's a challenge to the government. What's going undiscounted is that 2/3 of people in Britain want to vote left of centre. Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid, even the SNP, put them all together, you're talking about 2/3 of the electorate. And so there's a lot too much focus on what's going on the right, for understandable reasons, and not enough thinking, well, what if this is a big shift? What if all of those 2/3 of the voters voted for whoever could get rid of the Tories, which is what happened in Canada, because the Social Democratic and New Democrats, NDP in Canada, they shrunk as well as the Tories. The Liberals were the beneficiaries of it, and Labour, sitting in the middle of British politics, look like they're going to be the beneficiary of this big mood and this move towards, well, let's get away from this fighting on the right, let's actually sit as a kind of moderate centre-left government, progressive, with very modest ambitions, but the mood for change, and there is a mood for change going on in the electorate.
Now, you worked for Tony Blair in his slightly more radical years. It seemed to me as if he started out quite conservative paradoxically.
Became radical, yeah.
Yeah, but because at the time he didn't allow himself to think in the same way that Keir Starmer, who's 4 years almost exactly in power, isn't going to really allow him to think of the thought experiments you're saying. He would say, "No, John, shut up. We might blow it because look what happened in '92. The Sheffield rally again, almost the anniversary there was recently. So when Labour comes across as cocky, when Labour comes across as the government incumbent, the voters think you're a bit arrogant, and they might change their minds."
Look. Yeah, Labour loses so much in its head. There's always what if we lose, and that caution is there. And I think, look, Tony Blair only had one job in government, and that was Prime Minister. And as he said, when he got into office as Prime Minister, he had massive power, but not really clear about the agenda. At the end, he had less power, but a much clearer agenda. And I remember sitting around the cabinet table with other advisors discussing bringing in academies, and there's a lot of resistance about academies, a lot of resistance about the radical part of the agenda, and I went, he's got to the top, he's had 3 elections, let him do what he wants. The thing about Prime Ministers is let them execute the power that they have, and I think that unleashing the real Prime Minister, so I think there'll be a cautious manifesto, there'll be a cautious first term, but I do think you'll see, there are instincts that Keir has, which are going to be clear, but also there's dynamics in once you get a large parliamentary party, it has dynamics of its own. You have to manage your party. A lot of the Conservative government has been about managing the Tory party, not managing the country.
But this won't just be a large parliamentary party. We're talking about 2/3 of the House of Commons. So what then happens? How do you manage not just a large party, but a party that's going to have so many MPs who are new to Parliament, who won't have set foot there before, and they might be thinking to themselves, look, we have now got this massive, perhaps unrepeatable moment of power, and yet all the time Starmer's being cautious, he's still in his head, there's a massive Tories, but look at the Tories, they're a squabbling rump, now is the time for radicalism. So it might be quite difficult to manage these hundreds of MPs who might be impatient for change, and understandably so.
Look, I think that's right, and I think there's two things. One is you do have to, as much as you can, transmit downward. There's a discipline, there's a message discipline at the moment, there's a policy discipline at the moment, there's a tax and spend discipline. You have to bring that in, and when people come in, 2/3 of the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party, will be new to the House of Commons, not just new to government. You can teach them a lot of things, but there's also, I think, a sense in which you have to accept this is going to be a government formed and governing in the second quarter of the 21st century. So a very different social dynamic, very different makeup, all coming in one go, not coming in 30 or 40 or 50 each election.
A lot younger as well.
A lot younger. And I think they have a set of expectations about policy, or even common agreement across left and right, that the green agenda is massively important. It's not arguable. I think you see the beginnings of something in what Jeremy Hunt's been doing, shifting away the burden of taxation from people who work. Now, he'll never complete that shift, but what if Labour comes in with these younger generation of MPs, renters, not homeowners, who care about renters, not homeowners, and look at pensioners with inherited wealth by accident, I suppose, the wealth of housing, house value, you might see that opening up the possibility of not just shifting the burden of taxing work, shift the burden to taxing wealth. You start to solve a lot of problems in local government. During the pandemic, domestic house prices went up in value in the UK by £2 trillion. Nobody worked for that. Well, isn't there a solution in there somewhere for social care, for local authority funding, for all kinds of issues that are difficult for Labour? So I think the dynamic becomes not a left-right thing, but a modern and old thing. And that's a thing where lots of leaders to reform are modernisers. Very few of them have a modern generation behind them with such a scale. It's almost a bit like the 1945 moment when Labour went from a tiny party, which had been in coalition with Churchill and the Tories over the war, to being the majority party. That influx of new members, and that definitely has a momentum of its own, that you look hard to identify what the strands are, but it's a definite change.
When we start to think about the New Labour tribes, because every large political movement will have divisions. In your piece, you mentioned 2 interesting cleavages. One is geographical. You said there'll be quite a lot of sort of London and the South East tribes, there'll be Northerners. Now, their interests will not necessarily be aligned. So can you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, you look at some of the projections of the MRP polls, which go down to constituency level and build up the numbers. Scotland and Wales, which used to be huge contributors to the Labours and majorities, smaller now because of devolution. Scotland because of the dominance of the SNP. You look at the North West delivering over 70 MPs probably, but London, the big sweep in London, the Tories, as they've shown in their recent advert, they've given up on London. So London maybe 60 plus. But the biggest gain of all regions, Labour has 8 seats in the South East at the moment. It's going to have 13 new seats. So London South East, because a lot of the South East is a lot more like London now, with people moving out because of house prices, working from home. You got maybe 90 London South East MPs. It starts to swamp the North West. And then you look at, I counted maybe 20 MPs who are going to be MPs outside London but have been London councillors. So the London mentality may be the dominant mentality, over 100. And so it means, in a sense, the dynamics of the Labour Party could be sorted. It used to be Scotland, Wales, Yorkshire sort out the whole of the Labour Party by doing the numbers together. The biggest blocks, the North West and London, the South East. That could be productive because you might get a proper restoration of HS2. That's in both the interest of London and the South East and the North West. Or you might get conflict. But I suspect you'll get interesting imaginative demands for devolution, a different kind of devolution, and you'll see a different kind of Labour Party from the one that at the moment, kind of Keir, though a London MP and one of a string of London leaders that Labour's had recently, doesn't really talk about London, doesn't really talk about an offer to London. London may ask for something back after the election.
And what about the prospect of a Corbynista rekindling? Not in Jeremy Corbyn himself, of course, but I mean, right now, take Zara Sultana, for example. She has been on her best behaviour, knowing that if she says so much as a sentence wrong, Keir Starmer is itching for an excuse to zap her. But she will. People like her will have safety in numbers, I imagine. No, but this is what I want to know. Do you think that amongst the 450, one of the camps will be a socialist camp, a sort of far-left camp?
See, I think the interesting thing about modern politics is if you are the dominant voice on a new media channel, you're much more influential than if you're not. So Trump came to power really on the back of Twitter. In a way, it mimics the way that Kennedy was a TV president. If you're great in a new media, and Zara Sultana, who you named, Zara Sultana and Nadia Whittome, 2 MPs on the left, young, women of colour, they're the biggest politicians in the UK on TikTok. Now, TikTok's a real channel for communication. If the Labour leadership aren't there, and they're not really there, and if the government aren't there, who's talking to the TikTok generation? It's the left. And there's something about the green politics that appeals to young people, which I think is where the younger members of the Socialist Campaign Group are drifting towards. And that makes a different challenge because in himself, Keir's quite green, Ed Miliband's quite green. It's quite a green Labour front bench. They just haven't had the money to back it because of the constraints of public. So I think the influence of the younger generation of the left, if they stick to the far left demands of nationalisation, they'll be marginal, not marginalised, but just won't be part of the conversation. If they move centre stage and go, look, we're talking to the public, we're talking in this way, and we have ideas that chime on the red-green axis, then you're talking about a different dynamic. And that's, I think, one of the issues. You'll only see what the Labour Party in government is like in government. And the Labour Party backbenchers will only reveal themselves in the dynamic of it. Amongst the 450, the thing about Zara and Nadia is they don't just have channels, they've got views. What's the unity of analysis, of ideology amongst other members? Because Starmerism is yet to be formed. Rachel Reeves clearly has securonomics, but the notion of what the social and the economic agenda are together, that's in play, and I think clever young politicians will shape that.
And at the moment, Keir Starmer feels the gravitational pull of the Conservatives. He doesn't want to move too far away from them. Now, when the Conservatives shrink to be 100, perhaps even 50 by what you're saying, that gravitational pull will fall, and the gravitational pull of the 200-300 Labour backbenchers will be bigger. So it's difficult to tell right now what effect that's going to have, but it will be significant.
Look, and I think that's right. And I think the pull of the country. So there may not be a lot of seats for the Lib Dems or for the Greens, but there may be a lot of votes. And it may be that Labour, rather than guarding itself against losing votes to the right, will start to be concerned about, well, what happens to, if we're the centre of politics, what about the Greens on one side and what about the Lib Dems on the other side? So the dynamic of politics may be voters expressing their desire for a progressive party in government, but also voting for alternative views of what progressive politics are. And that will be attention too, because no party can successfully govern and only manage its own coalitions internally. It's got to manage the coalition of voters externally. And that idea we're moving towards potentially a government which is about, are we left-wing enough? Are we progressive enough? That changes the nature of the discourse too, and that's why it's really important to start looking at who are the backbenchers, what are the factions inside the Labour Party, and look at them dynamically, what they'll be like going into the future.
Thank you, John, and you can read about that and much more in Katie Ball's cover piece this week. Gang crime in Sweden is becoming something of a phenomenon, with 149 bombings last year alone. And to an extraordinary extent, these attacks are being carried out by children who are being enlisted in criminal gangs as early as the age of 10. In this week's magazine, Fredrik Kärrholm, a former Swedish police officer who's now a politician, writes about the attempt to understand this. He joins me now from Stockholm. Fredrik, what exactly do you think is going on? Is this the standard story of deprivation and crime, or is there more to it?
The difference really is what we're seeing now is very brutal, is very ruthless. We have always have crime in Sweden, of course. We have had organized crime for very long in different shapes and forms, but the ruthlessness and brutality is unheard of. And I have witnessed this close up as a police officer in Sweden, and have also analyzed this as a criminologist. So last year, 28 innocent citizens died or were seriously wounded in these shootings and bombings that occur on a daily basis now in Sweden. And our country has gone from the bottom of Europe's gun crime league to the top. So that's the problem in a nutshell. And in the last couple of years, we have seen that more and more young children are getting involved in this serious organized crime. And the question is, of course, why? And my take on this is that the main solution can be found in a criminal culture that has emerged in Sweden.
Can you say more then about this criminal culture? I mean, some of our viewers might have watched the Netflix drama Snabba Cash, which it's probably the closest you're going to get to a phenomenon happening here. But that depicts a kind of culture where the gangsters move in on the schools. Now they choose, and according to the narrative here, they choose the children because anybody under the 14 is immune from any criminal prosecution in Sweden. So they can be used as couriers to carry on small bomb attacks. They can even be given guns. In one of the scenes in Snabba Cash, one of the gangsters kills somebody else and he hands the gun to a kid saying, look, you'll be out in 4 years. There's no problem. Why don't you take the blame for it? And it does. It struck me that this dialogue would only have really been possible in Sweden. But I'm wondering, why has this culture where the children are involved come to pass?
So for a long time, the dominant explanation for crime in general and the gang crime in the political debate in Sweden has been socioeconomic factors. Parents' income, parents' education, the standard of living, and the main solution that has been presented has been more economic redistribution, more money to schools and a larger welfare state. However, Sweden has for long invested more money per school pupil than the average for OECD countries. The standard of housing in Sweden is consistently good, despite some overcrowdings. Economic inequality is lower in Sweden than EU average. And also, the last couple of years, we can see more and more children and young people from well-ordered homes and even the middle class getting involved in serious organized crime. So it's clear that this old explanatory model does not hold up. Furthermore, research also shows that the correlation between socioeconomics and crime is weak. So ultimately, crime is explained by the individual's values and morality. And values and morality are shaped by both peers and culture. And the question is, of course, why has this culture emerged in Sweden? What is this due to? And my answer would be we have had too much immigration causing segregation, too lenient school, too low expectation on parents, too mild punishments. And the sum of all this is the gangster culture that is now making a lot of children wanting to become gangsters. They are basically applying to the gangs and criminal networks to do criminal work, even murders.
All right. Now, I was in Stockholm last year, and you kindly took me to Rickeby, one of these so-called vulnerable areas in Sweden. Can you say a bit more about these vulnerable areas? It's a bit of a euphemism, but there are I think about 60 of them in Sweden. Now, the ghetto is perhaps too strong a word, but when I went to see it, I was expecting to see a place that was run down in the way that British welfare ghettos are run down. I once did a documentary for Channel 4 looking at how you can see visible signs of social decay. You can see needles on the streets, you can see alcohol shops, you can see signs of social decay everywhere. But in Rickeby, it was one of the nicest places that I've seen. It was prosperous, there was a beautiful 3G playing ground. You and I got talking to a bunch of kids, and one of them told me how he goes to this very good international English school. He was studying economics. They seem to have, when it comes to giving them life chances, Sweden seems to have really pushed the boat out to give these guys pretty much every opportunity that you could want, and yet still they're turning to gang crime.
Yeah, and that is completely correct. That is completely correct, and you can't describe these areas as ghettos. If you do, you have to call them luxury ghettos, because there's so many resources invested by the state, by the municipality in these areas. So there are really no excuses for committing crimes, other than that young people are growing up and are not absorbing good values and a good morality, and that is the problem. And look, no one is born a bad person. We are shaped during our upbringing by our peers, by our parents, the school, the culture we are consuming, and this is the root of the problem, that some parents do not take the responsibility. Schools are in some cases chaotic and does not provide good values, and children and their peers are consuming this gang culture, not only gangster rappers, but they can only in their own areas see older gang criminals that are proving that this gangster lifestyle is something that impresses other girls and is paying off. They are having nice clothes, expensive clothes, driving a nice car, and so on and so forth. And this is what we have to tackle now. So the previous election in 2022 revolved around this, and the mandate for the new Conservative government is now to take strong action against crime, not only violent gang crime, but also more sophisticated, invisible, system-threatening organized crime, as well as robbery against children and violence against women. And to do that, we need to put the bad guys in jail. It's as simple as that.
Oh, and one final question, Fredrik. I mean, people do talk about immigration. You spoke about it yourself. But the people being arrested, the people being tried, they're not immigrants. They're born in Sweden. They might have immigrant parents. They might be from an immigrant background. And I wonder if that means the problem is actually worse, that you've got other problems coming down the line, because Sweden has taken in more immigrants than it could digest, with long-term consequences that we're now beginning to see, not when the immigrants, but the children of the immigrants are hitting 10, 12 years old and joining a problem which you're struggling to solve.
Yeah, so first of all, there are problems among immigrants, but those crime problems are mainly concerning sexual crimes against women. But when it comes to organized crime and gang violence especially, the problem is mainly a problem that we have, as you say, children of immigrants committing these crimes. And this is caused by this criminal culture that has emerged in very segregated areas. So the segregation we have had a perfect storm in Sweden, where we have had a lot of immigrants coming to Sweden, creating these segregated areas where it's almost impossible to integrate in the Swedish society. And of course, these young children of immigrants are seeking an identity. and some kind of a culture of their own. And the gang culture has been very present in these areas, and not only has it provided a social status, it has also been very clear for these young people that it pays off. It payoffs. You can see the older gang criminals making a lot of money from committing crimes, facing a very low risk, are getting sentenced, and when they do are getting very mild sentenced. So we have had really a perfect storm in Sweden.
Fredrik, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. Earlier this year, Richard Dawkins wrote a Spectator diary and said that if he had to choose between Islam and Christianity, then he'd go for the latter, even though he's one of the world's most famous atheists. He's recently gone a bit further and declared himself a cultural Christian.
We are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer.
So is that really a thing? And should we see this as his baby steps towards perhaps a fuller conversion? I'm delighted to be joined by Sally Hitchiner, who's Associate Vicar at St Martin in the Fields, and by Esmé Partridge, who joins us from Clare College in Cambridge. Now, Sally, 10 years ago, you got to know Richard Dawkins because you both sat for an official portrait. So for 3 days, as I understand it, you had basically nothing else to do apart from to chat to him. Do you think you managed to get through to him? I mean, because back then, 10 years ago, I'm not sure he would be describing himself as any sort of Christian, let alone a cultural one.
I'm not sure I got through to him. I think he got through to me in some ways. I think I was very sceptical about who he was. I'd only ever seen him in a very combative role with religious leaders. And I was actually very charmed by him. He was very sweet and he was very sincere. He struck me as being someone who was slightly baffled that some people didn't really understand what he was saying on some occasions. But he definitely seemed to be very sincere, and I really enjoyed meeting him.
So, Sally, he says now that he is a cultural Christian. Do you think there is such a thing? I mean, I imagine if I asked you to define Christian, you would say quite simply somebody who believes in Jesus Christ, which obviously he doesn't.
I don't think he would say he believes Jesus rose from the dead. I think that's pretty clear from the interviews and the stuff he's done recently. But I'd say he believes Jesus is an historical figure and maybe even has some good moral advice for some people. And that's definitely the sort of tone of the conversation we had, and what I believe he said elsewhere since then. I think there's a question of, can you be a cultural Christian? I think there's a lot to be gained from the culture of Christianity. Perhaps we're really talking about Anglicanism here in his life and the life of others. And I think people like Tom Holland have highlighted the value that the Christian belief has offered Western society, and the idea that the individual matters and that we should care for the poor and all those sorts of things that I think Richard Dawkins would want to promote. Does he believe in any miracles? Does he believe that there is a God? Probably not, as far as I know. But I think there's still a lot to be gained from engaging with Christianity on lots of different levels.
Now, Esmé, you get lots of people who say, for example, that they're culturally Jewish, but they're not practicing. You can get people who enjoy carol services. One might even attend religious ceremonies and feel moved by it, even though they don't necessarily believe in God. So do you think we can see the emergence of people who can credibly call themselves cultural Christians and can be seen as part of the Christian movement?
I think it's absolutely possible, but I think the problem is it's not sustainable. And Dawkins, you might think, well, that's not relevant because he doesn't particularly want Christianity to persist. But actually, in the LBC interview, he explicitly said, well, I'm happy that the numbers of believers are going down, but I wouldn't be happy if our cathedrals closed and our beautiful parish churches had to shut. And I think that's where I would criticise, because while it may be possible in this particular cultural moment where we have enough of the vestiges of tradition to sustainably hold that position, those vestiges are very much fading, and I think we've come to the point where it's simply not enough to say, oh, yes, I'd like to keep this fruit of Christianity or this particular socio-cultural aspect of it, but just to use this sort of botanical analogy, which I mentioned in my article, to sever it from the root, that simply doesn't work, especially not in a time where there are other competing and arguably more compelling ideologies which actually do assert themselves and what they represent. Islam being, of course, the one on Dawkins' mind.
Sally, in your church, St Martin's in the Fields, it's world renowned for its music and its architecture and its position in London. But in your congregation, do you see regular people who, as far as you're aware, don't believe in God?
Well, I've never asked them all. I like to think I'm convincing them to believe in Christ in particular. That's why we preach, and what we hope we're conveying is. And I think there is something in the character of Christ which is very inviting and very compelling. But I would say that I would humbly suggest to Richard, if he was here now, that perhaps he is experiencing something of God in his love of the beauty of the music and the beauty of choral evensong and the carol services. I think there's something in goodness and truth and beauty as well as in truth, it to be engaged with in Christianity. And I think there's something about the heart of Christianity, as Esmé was talking about which I would say is Jesus Christ, which I think can be experienced without necessarily understanding or adhering to every particular line of the creed. I think it often leads us into truth, and I suspect you can't engage with something as beautiful as choral music and evensong without being moved in some way towards the divine. And I would say Christ, but I think I think there's lots of reasons why people reject the formal language of religion. Some of them very sincere and very good, and sometimes people are rejecting the church because they don't see enough of what they imagine God should be like in us. And I think there's something actually I would call worshipful about rejecting the church, because it doesn't look like, if there is a God, it wouldn't look like us. And I don't know Richard well enough to know why he's rejecting the language of Christianity and things like that. But I definitely take it as a huge step forward and a huge compliment that he's willing to say anything positive about us at all, because I can't imagine he sells many books by doing that.
Esmé, I would have thought that where you are now in Cambridge University, the evidence of cultural Christianity is all around you. And there was lots of these evensong services. You've got choirs attended by really quite people who are devout, shall we say, to the art of what they do. But not all of them, to put it mildly, believe in God. And Cambridge is full of colleges named after Saint this and Saint that, and without any kind of ecclesiastical hope altogether, purpose at all. And also, take choral music, for example. You've got John Rutter, one of the greatest, perhaps, living writers of choral music. He doesn't believe in God, yet he's been able to give us some of the most incredible choral music that's ever been written. So it would seem as if the influence and the power of non-believing Christianity, if you want to call it that, is strong and is getting stronger.
Well, I think it's a mixed picture, because on the one hand, yes, of course, there is this atmosphere of if you want to call it cultural Christianity, very much permeating, and it does speak to a lot of people. You certainly get people who actually become Christians at university, I think, because they experience the chapel and that kind of pastoral aspect of the college. But at the same time, it's not all going in one direction. Just the other week, we heard about St John's Voices really sacrificing their tradition of Anglican choral music for more diverse types of song. And I don't know exactly what that entails, but if you can look at the way that some other college chapels are going, it may well be more in the direction of renouncing a uniquely Christian identity and tradition for a more multicultural one. So, for example, multi-faith chapels are only a few. I wouldn't want to exaggerate, but certainly a trend we are starting to see. So Queen's College, I believe, or is it St Catherine's? I need to double check, but that is now a multi-faith. They're embracing a more multi-faith model. Now, that's not something I think is bad. And actually, I'm studying the philosophy of religious pluralism, so I'm by no means saying that's inherently bad, but it is a sign of a sense of Christian identity, which, while it may bask in those aesthetic mores and the beauty of choral music and all of these other wonderful things, if it's not strong enough to actually assert itself, over time the trend does overwhelmingly seem to be that it's renouncing itself ultimately for other more diverse belief systems, and long term I don't see how Christianity would maintain its cultural dominance even in these elite institutions, with that being the trend.
And Sally, isn't that the risk, that you basically end up diluting the faith? That if you just sell the kind of warm and fuzzy bits about the faith, like God is like a cup of tea, etc., then you miss out the core of the Bible's message. You miss out the core of Christianity. In fact, you start to become a place not really of Christianity, but of sort of music and aesthetics, which is fine and there's a place for it, but it's difficult to call it religion if it's not actually belief.
It's difficult to call it working class. And I think actually one of the things at the heart of Christianity is that we follow a working class Messiah. And I think a lot of the trappings that we talk about when we talk about sort of cultural Christianity are essentially just core music or things that we often associate with middle class values. But I think actually Richard is pointing at something deeper. I think there is a sense of ethics, a sense of a commitment to living for others, public service, caring for the poor, living a life that is following the model of people like Jesus, which I think is actually open to everyone. I think there is something really important in that goes beyond the trappings, as we call them.
Is any of that really Christian? By no stretch of the English language, I submit. Is that? I mean, we can't. If you're saying it's Christian, then you're saying that Christians do this in the way that Hindus don't, or Muslims don't, or Chinese Buddhists don't. I mean, these are virtues. I get it; they're admirable. Every Christian should aspire to them, but they're not identifiably Christian. I mean,
well, Tom Holland would disagree with you. The historian Tom Holland would point to the idea that prior to Christianity, the idea that the powerful should care about the weak was totally alien to Greek and Roman gods and the sorts of societies that were prevalent around that time. Is it only Christianity that has discovered it? Of course not. But I would argue that God works in all sorts of different ways, and that we can discern these things in different faiths as well as in Christianity, which is why I found some of Richard's comments a little bit perplexing, perhaps. I have some colleagues who are Muslims who I think are doing extraordinary work and are living by those values that I see in Christ. But I think there's something really important that is at the centre of Christianity, which you may see through the trappings, but also you can easily just miss, and that is the personal life commitment that Christianity is. I mean, the Americans talk about being a born again Christian as if you're an entirely new person, and in Anglicanism we have a much more institutional idea that you can grow and a whole community can grow together, and through sharing what we have with our parishes, with our communities, and that actually, I think once you are not so focused on the idea that God sends everyone to hell, there is a possibility of finding a generous version of religion which can allow people to discover things on the edges and find value in them without needing to deconstruct that.
And Esmé, just quickly, I mean, the conversion process takes some time, doesn't it? I mean, anybody who's been a member of a church will know what the idea is. You get somebody to come along to a Christmas service, you get them to enjoy the aesthetics, then you try to sell the harder truths to them, and by the end of it, we could be seeing Richard Dawkins' book, Why I Became a Christian.
Well, possibly. I mean, I think actually Dawkins can be placed within a very specific and quite established tradition within the liberal sort of history, and that's actually a very kind of 18th century position of someone like Montesquieu, who believes in Christianity as a social institution, but at the same time is ruthlessly mocking it and totally incredulous towards its actual truth claims, and that was a very, very common position during the Enlightenment, and I think especially the 18th century, where you have on the one hand this total hostility towards the contents, but at the same time this conviction that but of course this great social order we have because of religion is self-evident, that's never going to go away. And I think that was very much the position that I got from his LBC interview and comments he's made elsewhere. The problem with that position, I think, is that as I said earlier, it hasn't really been vindicated by history as being particularly sustainable. I think there's a certain naivety about it, actually, to think that these Christian values are self-evident and that they'll be capable of being upheld even while the truth claims of the religion aren't. I think, one only has to look at how liberalism, for example, something which was originally premised on Christian foundations, but took it for granted that people would always have this basic Christian character and there'd always be this biblical morality. But that clearly hasn't really been the case. I mean, unless you're a practicing Christian, today your idea of liberty is probably completely disembedded from those original Christian values. So the reason I say all of this is because I think it's a very established tradition, and that cynicism towards belief, I find it hard to imagine Dawkins coming out of that. I think he's likely to take this more instrumentalist, very Enlightenment view of religion as socially useful, but fundamentally untrue.
I'm more hopeful, actually. I think there is I really think that he's got something, that his experience goes beyond what his intellect is willing to engage with, or perhaps his book sales are willing to engage with. I think there's something. I expect I'll see Richard in heaven, actually. I suspect I'll see. He might be surprised to get there, but I really do expect that I will engage with him and see him in the afterlife in a way that I recognise as Christian.
Well, on that heavenly note, Sally and Esmé, thank you very much for joining me on Spectator TV. Now, think of country music, and you might think of slide guitars or cowboy hats, but you're probably thinking of a white singer. In the history of country music, there have been only 8 black women who've got on the country music charts. That 8 has now become 9 with Beyoncé's new album, Cowboy Carter. It's been favourably reviewed by Rod Liddle in this magazine. He joins me now, as does Ricky Ross, the Deacon Blue frontman and presenter of Another Country, the BBC radio show on country music and Americana. Now, Ricky, let's start with you. You've been playing the music of country musicians and interviewing country musicians for quite some time now, and it goes without saying that the genre tends to be white artists. Now, Beyoncé says her new album was born out of an experience she had years ago where, in her words, she did not feel welcome. Now, we assume that she's referring to her cameo at the 2016 Country Awards, where she did a duet with the Dixie Chicks, which went down controversially, shall we say, amongst some fans. Some of them walked out. Anyway, so she describes this album as her attempt to kind of break into a genre where she felt some kind of resistance. Now, having interviewed and spoken to so many country musicians, what's your feeling about the link then between country music and culture? Is this fundamentally a white person's music?
Well, it's really interesting you should ask, because and I'm just counting back now, October 21, someone at BBC in Scotland said, look, let's celebrate Black History Month, and can all programmes kind of come on board? And I remember my producer saying, what are we going to do? And I said, well, let's have a think about this. And we actually have a 2-hour show, and we played African-American artists for 2 hours. And all of them were ones that we either have played before or would be playing quite a lot of in the future, and all of whom were doing really interesting things. And they would say, and I think Beyoncé would say, they are, taking back some of the music that they brought in the first place. That obviously has crossed over in a lot of ways. And so, as you rightly say, there haven't been many Black artists, certainly Black women on the chart. I mean, one of the other things that we've highlighted on the show that's been interesting is talking to many country artists, singers, is that country radio, not only does it not maybe sometimes play Black artists, which you can understand, but also plays very few women. That's one of the other really weird things about it, given that there are so many creative country artists who are women and who are great songwriters, great singers. So there are problems within country music that are there. And I think sort of Beyoncé is sort of, I suppose, answering some of these things. I'm not quite sure if I'm answering your question, but I think she belongs. And I think it's interesting. But clearly, if you listen to the album, it's not just a country album. As she says very rightly, it's a Beyoncé album.
Right. Now, Rod, you say in your review that that Beyoncé is a Texas girl. She basically competed in rodeos when she was younger. Do you think she's trying to make a point with this album, or is it just good music?
Yes, I think she is, and I'm not sure the point is as valuable as the album. I mean, Ricky's right. There have always been a limited number of Black performers in country music, and probably more than we should really be aware of. And part of that is down to the fact that as Ricky rightly says, the country music institution in the US has always been very conservative, and all of my favourite country artists have been people from beyond that. So the outlaw country music of the 1960s and 70s with Waylon Willie and David Allen Coe to a degree, though there are problems with him as well, but particularly Guy Clark. But of course, I mean, just like rock and roll, country music is a hybrid of you lot, you Scots and Irish, and with a huge blues influence as well. I mean, bluegrass is exactly what it says. It may be a pun on the bluegrass you have in Kentucky, but it's also a form of country music which derives directly from black blues music of the Mississippi Delta. So it's always been there. And Ricky's absolutely right, and you're absolutely right. The country music stations, particularly, don't play it very much. I mean, one of the interesting things with the Beyoncé album is that while she does play quite a lot of country music, what she doesn't do is play the form of country music which is very ochre on American radio, but also to us. She doesn't sound like the Eagles. There's no country rock there. This kind of bastard hybrid which came out, you know, at the end of the 60s with some very good bands actually at the time, but which grew into this behemoth of blandness, which sort of railroaded its way through the 70s. The other thing, just quickly, is to say that in a way Beyoncé is giving back, because a rather large number of white country musicians, and Ricky will know this, people like Sturgill Simpson, have been plundering hip-hop and black beats for the last 10 years, you know, and bringing that into country music. And Miley Cyrus has done the same thing, you know, originally a country artist.
Ricky, when the country music stations were explaining why they didn't want to play some of Beyoncé's earlier music, they were saying, well, it's not proper country, which begs the question, what is proper country? It's sometimes said that country music, one definition I heard is that it's 3 chords and the truth. But I guess thematically, what truth is it? I mean, you could say, listening to it, that is, I don't know, life is hard, God is real, whiskey helps. Those are the truths which you tend to hear in country music, but also there tends to be a bit of nostalgia, like the past is better than the present. Now, perhaps that is the point of departure for the demographics of America.
It's interesting. I'm just having a weekend reflecting. A few weeks ago at Country to Country, did lots of interviews with the artists that were playing Country to Country, and more than once someone said to me, "That's my truth," which is kind of a modern cliche, which amuses me greatly. The thing about that great quote, of course, is by Harlan Howard, the great songwriter, and that 3 chords and the truth hangs above the Country Music Hall of Fame, one of the great places in Nashville you need to go if you ever go there. What defines country music is interesting, and fun is, an artist said this to me recently. Sometimes it's to do with the lyric. It's definitely to do with the lyric more than it is to do with the sound of the song. And I think where lyrics go, I mean, one of the things that draws me towards wanting to be able to write a country song is the times when I've just almost stopped the car and thought, wish I could have written that, wish I could have said that, because it sums it up so beautifully. But musically now, it's so diverse. And Rod's absolutely right. Hip hop has come into it hugely. But what does amuse me, if we go back to the subject that we're meant to be talking about, which is about Beyoncé, is that if you're going to get critical of Beyoncé for not sounding country, then I challenge you to listen to a country music station, a satellite station or an online station. Someone who maybe, take a music lover who doesn't think they love country music, because it won't sound like the country music they remember. I mean, Rod was talking to people like Guy Clark and Waylon Jennings and so on. It won't sound like that. It will sound like modern pop music. And if you put some of the tracks that you'll hear on a modern country radio station beside some of the things that you're going to hear on Radio 2, you'll be struggling to hear the difference, really.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you could even make the case, because country music, and particularly the old Opry and Nashville, the country music it's always championed is something. The term was coined, I think, in the early 60s, countrypolitan. So it was artists such as Lynn Anderson with "I Beg Your Pardon, I Never Promised You a Rose," which is a good song, but later Crystal Gale. This is very well produced. It doesn't frighten anybody. It's not Townes Van Zandt. You could well argue that Beyoncé is more authentic to the actual feel of country music and to the origins of country music than Countrypolitan is, which has become a rather, I mean, it's in the charts at the moment. Shania Twain is Countrypolitan, basically, or was. And it's rather more rootsy than that. And I think that's interesting and great to see.
But Ricky, there has been, over the years, we know there's been a link between race and music. And one of Deacon Blue's first songs, Fergus Sings the Blues, is fundamentally asking whether a guy called Fergus, can this white man sing the blues? That's the refrain. I've always wondered if there's something autobiographical about that. You are a big blues fan yourself. Did you feel starting out that in a way there were sort of areas of music that you'd struggled to be taken seriously, and that there is an extent to which musicians are kind of cast from an early age by what they look like, where they're from?
It's interesting. I mean, you're from the north of Scotland, Fraser. You'll know this. A sense in which you have imposter syndrome about anything that you do. I think sometimes when you're from Scotland, you feel like, I didn't really know how to get into the music business. The only person that I knew that had ever had a record deal in Dundee, where I grew up, was a guy called Michael Mara. And Michael wrote this great iconic song called Gale's Blue, which it was about a guy coming down from the Highlands wanting to be a rock and roll or a blues artist or an R&B artist. And that sort of inspired Fergus Sings the Blues, because I never have an original idea in my head. I've always got to borrow. I'm like Bob Dylan. I need to borrow extensively. But
everybody does.
But everyone does. I think that's true. But I think there is this thing about being an imposter, and I think that the question is always there. And I think if you don't have that feeling, if you don't have the feeling of being an outsider, then it takes something away, because I think that's part of the joy. I think it's elbowing your way into a world that you have loved. I mean, we have all grown up loving pop music, loving the mystery of it. And suddenly when you're on top of the pops or whatever it is that you're hoping to hear, maybe hear your record on the radio, suddenly to belong there, to belong in that company is the dream, isn't it? If your record's sandwiched between two of your favorite artists on the radio, you just think, I've made it.
And Rod, I wonder, I mean, in Britain, we don't have things like country music charts, not in the same way. We tend not to think of segregate music in that way.
Very, very good point. Especially as Ricky's such a lover of country music and tries to write country songs, we've given very little to country music, aside maybe from most of its origins. And that was largely, as I say, Scotland and Ireland, and the Scottish and Irish immigrants in the Appalachians and beyond, who gave that first great burst of what became country music, I guess through folk, through the original folk music. And I used to wonder why there weren't more Scottish country bands. And I was chided by this by my great friend, Rab Noakes, bless him, when he was alive, who made what I think is the greatest British country album, Red Pump Special, back in 1973.
Well said, Rod.
A really lovely album.
Lovely man. And of course, Rab was
a really lovely man, yeah.
Rab was responsible for the radio show that came before our radio show. So we sort of, we are sitting on Rab's shoulders, as it were. So very much, absolutely. He went over to Nashville. First Scottish person that went over to Nashville to record that, right? To record at that time as well.
Really, really beautiful album. And it sounded the part. I mean, partly because it was done in Nashville with Nashville production, but partly also because Rab's a very good songwriter and underrated one. But he did chide me about saying, why don't Scottish bands play country music more often? Why aren't there more Scottish country bands? He said, no, it's an American phenomenon. It's not really us, And he felt an imposter, just as Ricky was talking about feeling an imposter. It's treading into that territory.
But Scotland has got folk music, hasn't it, Ricky?
Yeah.
Is that? I mean, that's a difference. That has tended to be our equivalent when you look at, again, the demographics, the bonding with home, if you like. It's tended to be the traditional music that Scotland has exported to Canada, Spain, and the rest of the world.
Yes, it has. I think there's something significantly different about. I mean, listen, folk music probably, yes, in the 50s, 60s maybe was this. I think the key to country music understanding it is, I think it's still a people's music. I still think that there's something about the fact that the ordinary Joe, whether he be male, female, black or white, whatever, I think there's still something about it being the people's music. And sort of because it keeps that framework of 3 minutes, you know, in the 60s, it was probably 2 minutes of a song, but you know, within that, it's telling stories, the great stories. Rodney Crowell would say you have to love a ghost story, but there are stories essentially within these little 3 minute windows that they create. And I think that people's music and the fact that it's still popular music, whereas folk music has become, you know, because of the nature of it, it's become more esoteric, you know, I think as well. But I think country music is popular. It's popular music that's from the South. And if you grew up in the South, if you're from Alabama, you might become Jason Isbell, or if you're Mississippi, you might become Marty Stewart. That's your music that you grew up with. And it's not like a choice. It's not like I'm going to be a country musician. It's just that someone hands you a mandolin and off you go, because that's the music that you know.
Yes, Isbell certainly didn't think it was a choice. He felt he had no option but to play this music. I was just thinking about the Scottish input. I suppose Stealers Wheel were a kind of country band. Certainly Jerry Rafford, actually more Joe Egan in a way. Were a kind of country band put together as being by record companies as being Britain's answer to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And you know, great musicians and some lovely songs there. But I agree with Rick generally on that. That yes, it's a I hate to bring class into it, but it is a kind of working class music.
And we shouldn't overlook the Proclaimers, Fraser and Rod, as well, because you know the
Proclaimers. Yeah,
the Proclaimers are in that tradition. They absolutely love Merle Haggard, and beautifully, their daughter, one of their daughters, Roseanne Reid, who's making a fine country tradition, went to the Steve Earle Writing School and is playing gigs, and we've supported her on the show. So the tradition goes on.
And Ricky Ross's show, Another Country, can be heard on the iPlayer, and Rod Liddle's unmissable music review column in The Spectator. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me. And that's it for this week. Do consider subscribing to the show if you haven't already by clicking on the subscribe button. Almost 350,000 subscribers now. There aren't quite as many of that to The Spectator magazine itself, but you can change that by going to spectator.co.uk/subscribe and try us for free, and then from just £1 a week. It's the best value in publishing. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.